Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I'm in Edinburgh, and behind me is the grave of the father of capitalism, Adam Smith. Well, perhaps didn't invent capitalism, but really did more to promulgate capitalist theory than anybody else with his celebrated tome, The Wealth of Nations. So he was born here in North Britain in 1723 in the town of Kirkcaldy, which is some way north of here, because in between Edinburgh and Kirkcaldy is a body of water called the Firth of Forth. A firth is a bay in Scotland. And so obviously you can go over the Forth road bridge or rail bridge these days. Back then they would have gone to Queensferry, South Queensferry, and taken the boat to North Queensferry. That peninsula is called Fife, and in Fife you'll find the town of Kirkcaldy. So his father was a lawyer, but Adam Smith was a posthumous child. Smith's father died just before Smith's mother gave birth to him. So that was that. So they grew up in somewhat straitened circumstances, though they were certainly middle class. So that was 1723, and bear in mind, only about half the population could read, even to a very basic level. So obviously he was far above average financially in the fact that there were books in the house. So he distinguished himself at school. He was a very odd character, seemed to be lacking in gross motor skills, go around speaking to himself, extraordinarily absent-minded, may well have had Asperger's, though that condition wasn't recognised till the early 20th century. So then Adam Smith, he went to Glasgow University in his mid-teens, as was the norm in those days. The corpus of knowledge was just much smaller, and obviously the lifespan was shorter, which is why people often went to university as young as 15, boys only, of course. Incidentally, he was a member of the Church of Scotland, which was the church as by law established. He was not particularly religious, just averagely so here for the era. And one of the great controversies of his youth was the Jacobites, because in 1688, James II, or as we say here in Scotland, James VI, had been ousted, and it was his descendants trying to come back and reclaim the throne from the Hanoverians. But Adam Smith had no truck with the Jacobites. Most members of the Church of Scotland didn't. The Jacobite claimants were Catholics. They had support from the Catholic minority in Scotland, a few Episcopalians, and very few people who were in the Church of Scotland. Anyway, he was taught by an Irish academic at Glasgow. I can't remember the man's name, actually. So a seminal influence on him. And he became enthused by the writings of David Hume, another member of the Scottish Enlightenment, well, luminary of the Scottish Enlightenment, who was intellectually en vogue at the time, a Tory historian, scathing of the Whig fallacy and so on, a philosopher, despite never having graduated, but having attended university even for a couple of years, even if you were left without a degree, was still a great distinction in those days. And amused me to see as a bike lock, keeping it closed. What, in case we go in and steal there? I suppose we might otherwise want to chip off the stone and try to get souvenirs. So I noticed, there's sort of curtain effect there, a part of this funereal masonry, and then above the that sort of gravestone, as it were, the lion's head, stylized lion's head. Does it look more like a sort of a head of Aristotle or something? And I was just reading the inscription on that stone plate down there: the property which every man has in his own labour, as it is the original foundation of all other property, is the most sacred and the most inviolable. Well, really sums it up, a quotation from him. Anyway, he later won the Snell exhibition to go to Balliol College, Oxford. So Mr. Snell was a very wealthy merchant, and he set this up. So someone who graduated from the University of Glasgow could go to Balliol, and it's still going to this day. So Oxford University consisted of about 20 colleges back then. Balliol is arguably the oldest and had very long-standing links with North Britain, because John Balliol had helped found it, a nobleman who owned extensive estates in both South Britain and North Britain. You remember the founder of that Balliol College, another John Balliol, was the Tombed Tabard, the empty coat, who was briefly King of Scots in the late 13th century, perceived as a puppet of Edward II of England. Anyway, so there he covered himself in glory in Balliol as well. Obviously people were learning things through Latin and ancient Greek, and you wouldn't do just one subject. There was a thing called political economy, which we now call economics, as well as classics or history or philosophy or anything else, or even the sciences. They often call that natural philosophy. But you do those through classical languages. Anyway, so he graduated. He was tutor to the son of the Duke of Buccleuch for a while, went on the Grand Tour with him, and only he gradually became fascinated by economics, by commerce, asked himself, why is it some countries are wealthier, why are some poorer? In the mid 18th century, this country was experiencing the birth pangs of the Industrial Revolution, and a few scientific breakthroughs were being made. And why was that? And why are some people so affluent? Why are some people living in penury? How does it change? What should governments do? So it tended to favour laissez-faire, laissez-passer, although he wasn't an absolute non-interventionist, but leant that way. He saw how governments could tweak things one thing or the other, or people could abuse their office to enrich themselves by setting up various laws, creating monopolies, banning this, a higher tax on whatever it was. So he wanted minimal government, believed if people all pursued self-interest, that would be better for the common weal, because we'd be producing better goods and services and so forth. So he never wed, lived with his mother for quite some time. So he was back here in Caledonia, and for the last 14 years of his life lived in Panmure House. You can't quite see it. It's the far side of this church, where he was a tax inspector, died, and obviously was buried here. So that is Adam Smith, an incredibly influential person down to this day. There's an Adam Smith Institute which is named in his honour. He's an author of a number of more minor works. So The Wealth of Nations is celebrated for the pellucidity of its prose, but people also castigate it because there's a lack of worked examples. There's no data in there. It's written in a very 18th century style, and he capitalizes every noun, a bit like German. Although in modern editions they sometimes change that just to render it into ordinary English. If you're a modern grammarian, you wouldn't countenance having all the nouns with capitals. So that's enough about Adam Smith. Well, I shan't disturb his property because it's inviolable, so we won't be nicking one of these stones as a souvenir. That's enough about Adam Smith.